6 months after my father died, my mother found something hidden behind books in his study, a worn meditation cushion and a small notebook. My father was a practical engineer who built bridges and calculated stress loads. He never spoke of any interest in spirituality, at least not to us. Yet here were pages showing he'd been secretly studying Buddhist teachings about consciousness and death, trying to understand one tradition's vision of what might happen after the body stops functioning. His investigation led him to Tibet's most detailed contemplative map of the afterlife, a tradition that describes a 49-day journey through states where consciousness navigates self-created experiences before choosing its next existence. Tonight, we explore what my father discovered about this Buddhist vision of death, and what it reveals about how one ancient culture approached humanity's deepest mystery. I'm Peter, and we're about to examine one of Buddhism's most elaborate attempts to map what happens after we die. We've explored the Tibetan Book of the Dead before on this channel, covering the 6 Bardos. If you haven't seen that episode, watch it first for foundational understanding. Tonight, we focus specifically on how Tibetan Buddhism envisions the 3 post-death Bardos, their contemplative description of consciousness during the 49 days after death. While the title might suggest universal truth, we're exploring one tradition's vision of post-death consciousness, not claiming it represents objective reality. Different Buddhist traditions offer completely different visions of death. Many Theravada teachers describe immediate rebirth based on the final mind moment. Pure Land Buddhism emphasizes instant transition to Amitabha's realm through devotion. Zen traditions focus on recognizing that there's ultimately no permanent self to die or be reborn. Tibetan Buddhism developed one of the most elaborate contemplative visions of intermediate consciousness states. As contemporary Tibetan teacher Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche notes, these represent lived wisdom within our tradition requiring proper cultural understanding. In traditional practice, these teachings aren't studied casually. They require years of preliminary training under qualified lamas, including 100,000 prostrations, visualization practices, and devotional preparation. We're encountering them outside this traditional framework, which offers insights but also creates significant limitations in our understanding. These teachings trace back to texts compiled by Yeshe Tsogyal and revealed by Karma Lingpa in the 14th century, preserved within Tibetan culture. For those engaging with their approach to consciousness exploration, modern neuroscience offers different perspectives on consciousness and death. But these ancient contemplative visions remain fascinating examples of how human cultures have attempted to map the unmappable. According to Tibetan Buddhist teaching, the first phase begins at the moment of death, what they call the clear light, when consciousness supposedly separates from the body. The Bardo Thodol contains this instruction. When the mind is without support, that is Dharmakaya, a cryptic reference to consciousness encountering what they consider its essential nature. This represents the Chikhai Bardo in their framework, lasting from the moment of death through roughly the first day. The tradition teaches that consciousness encounters what they consider its own fundamental nature, without thoughts or emotions overlaying it. Traditional Tibetan teachers describe this as awareness recognizing awareness itself, though what this actually means requires extensive contemplative training to understand. Most practitioners, according to this tradition, find this overwhelming and faint into unconsciousness, missing what they consider the ultimate liberation opportunity. Then consciousness supposedly moves into what they call the Chönyid Bardo, where peaceful deities begin manifesting over the following days. Avalokiteshvara appears as overwhelming compassion within this contemplative vision. But Tibetan Buddhism teaches these aren't external beings. They represent consciousness, meeting its own unlimited capacities in symbolic form. If consciousness doesn't recognize the peaceful manifestations as its own projections according to this teaching, they begin appearing in wrathful forms. Yamantaka manifests as a terrifying destroyer figure, representing what the tradition sees as wisdom's power to eliminate the illusion of permanent selfhood. Whether these deity encounters represent literal post-death experiences or sophisticated psychological symbolism developed within Tibetan culture cannot be determined from our position, but they reveal remarkable contemplative creativity in approaching death. Have you ever wondered what it would mean to recognize awareness itself, not thoughts or emotions, but the knowing quality that observes them? The phase that most challenges our understanding comes in what Tibetan Buddhism calls the Sidpa Bardo, the Bardo of becoming, supposedly lasting from day 15 through day 49. According to this tradition, consciousness creates experienced reality through thought and emotion during this phase, though this obviously represents claims beyond current verification. Let me pause here because this is where my father's engineering mind really struggled with these teachings. During his final month, instead of avoiding talk about dying, he began asking his doctors detailed questions about the dying process. He started meditating daily and told my mother he felt curious rather than terrified about what came next. His notebook showed attempts to understand these reality creation claims. If consciousness really creates experience, maybe I can approach dying as an opportunity for conscious navigation rather than passive suffering. According to their psychology, every action, word, and thought creates karmic imprints stored in consciousness. During this phase, these patterns supposedly activate and project as experiences. The tradition describes several categories. Life review, not judgment by external beings, but the natural consequences of actions playing out. Emotional environments, their teaching claims emotional states generate corresponding realms. Anger creating hell realms of conflict, love manifesting pure lands of beauty, confusion generating shifting landscapes. Whether this literally occurs after death cannot be verified, but the tradition developed these descriptions through centuries of contemplative investigation within their cultural framework. He realized these teachings weren't asking him to believe specific post-death scenarios, but to understand consciousness as more creative and malleable than he'd assumed. This shift transformed his final weeks, approaching death as a transition requiring awareness rather than something to simply endure. The final stage in Tibetan Buddhist teaching involves consciousness approaching 6 colored doorways, each supposedly leading to different realms of existence. Traditional texts describe this moment with characteristic symbolic language, but the psychological insights within this framework offer interesting perspectives on human motivation patterns. According to their tradition, though color realm associations vary significantly across different Tibetan lineages, white light supposedly leads to god realms of pleasure and comfort. Yellow light opens to demigod realms of competition and power. Red light attracts to hungry ghost realms of insatiable craving. Green light leads to animal realms of instinctual existence. Blue light offers human realms balancing pleasure and pain. Smoky gray light leads to hell realms of intense suffering. What stands out here isn't whether consciousness literally chooses post-death destinations, but how this framework maps different ways awareness can organize experience based on dominant psychological patterns. Do you typically choose comfort over growth, competition over cooperation, wanting over appreciation? The tradition teaches that these same patterns supposedly determine post-death attraction. But more immediately, we can observe how they operate in daily choices. Understanding these specific teachings suggests 3 unique practices. Clear light practice, daily awareness of the moment between sleep and waking, when consciousness transitions between states. Projection practice, recognizing when emotional states create entire narratives about situations, noticing the difference between what's happening and the story you're creating about it. Attraction practice, during stress, notice which of the 6 psychological realms you default to: comfort-seeking, competition, craving, confusion, balanced awareness, or suffering. My father never solved every question in his notebook, but his search taught me something crucial about approaching mystery. He'd written near the end, "These teachings don't provide certainty about what happens after death. They offer frameworks for approaching the unknown with awareness rather than pure fear." During his final week, something remarkable happened. After learning about the clear light teaching, he started paying attention to the moment between sleep and waking, saying it felt like practice for the big transition. But I need to be honest, some days I convinced myself these teachings had genuinely helped him. Other days I worried I was romanticizing his final months to avoid facing the randomness of death. Instead of the anxiety and denial we'd expected, he demonstrated genuine curiosity about the dying process. He asked to have the Bardo Thodol read to him, not because he believed it literally, but because he found the contemplative framework helpful for maintaining awareness during transition. When pain medications made him confused, he would practice the simple recognition of awareness itself. The same principle these death teachings emphasize. His approach to dying changed completely, from something happening to him to something he could participate in consciously. These teachings represent Tibetan Buddhism's attempt to provide detailed guidance for navigating death consciously, developed within their specific cultural and religious context over many centuries. Whether consciousness actually continues after death in the ways these teachings describe remains beyond current verification. But their frameworks offer sophisticated approaches to mortality that emphasize awareness rather than denial. The practices didn't eliminate grief. They gave me a framework for working with it consciously instead of being completely overwhelmed. Years later, I still don't know if his transformation was genuine spiritual insight or psychological coping mechanism. Maybe both. 3-breath practice from the 49-day tradition. Take 3 slow breaths. Between each breath, notice the brief pause where no thought is present. According to this tradition, that pause represents the same awareness these death teachings point toward. Consciousness recognizing its own nature without mental overlay. We've explored Tibetan Buddhism's most detailed vision of your consciousness after death, from day 1's clear light recognition through days 2 to 14's deity encounters, to days 15 to 49's reality creation and rebirth selection. These teachings represent one tradition's elaborate attempt to map what remains unmappable, developed through centuries of contemplative investigation within their cultural framework. My father's search reminded me that approaching ultimate questions with honest curiosity can transform how we live, even without definitive answers about what happens after death. Science may describe consciousness as brain events, but Tibet framed them as awareness maps for navigating the ultimate transition. Each approach offers different insights into the mystery of what we are. This is how Tibetan Buddhism explains your consciousness after death, a 49-day journey through recognition, projection, and choice. But here's where our exploration takes an unexpected turn. These Tibetan teachings describe your consciousness transforming over 49 days after death. What if similar death and renewal processes happen continuously in daily life? What if you're already navigating micro versions of these same transitions every moment? Next week, we'll explore why you've died 1,000 times and how every cell in your body undergoes constant death and regeneration, how your consciousness dissolves and recreates itself moment by moment, how understanding micro-deaths transforms your relationship with macro-death. What we'll discover suggests that these ancient insights about transition and renewal apply to processes happening continuously throughout life, making death less foreign and more familiar than you typically imagine. If tonight's exploration sparked your curiosity about how different cultures approach mortality, subscribe and activate notifications. Share this with anyone interested in contemplative approaches to consciousness and death. Tell us in the comments which aspect of the Tibetan vision most intrigues you. Have you noticed attraction patterns similar to the 6 realms operating in your own experience? Remember, while we can't verify claims about post-death consciousness, we can learn from how contemplative traditions have approached these ultimate questions with sophisticated frameworks developed over centuries. Until next time, stay curious, stay wise,